Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. So many people nowadays give young folks the advice, follow your passion. I don't necessarily believe that advice. I think you should choose something that you can make a living at, and then in your off time you follow your passion. But today we're going to take a look at a guy that did, in fact, follow a passion that he had. As a matter of fact, he followed it all over the United States, and it led him down some very, very dark paths. As a matter of fact, it led him down a path that wound up terminating at a location where he was infamously crowned as perhaps the most prolific serial killer the United States has ever known. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about Samuel Little, a serial killer who has now since passed on. But more importantly, we're going to talk about one of his victims, a victim that has remained unidentified since 1977. I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags. Dave Mack is with me. He's a senior crime reporter for Crime Online. Dave, I'm going to throw a trick question at you here. It's not really a trick question. It's something you got to kind of dig back through your files. I want to see if you can, off the top of your head, give me an idea as to how many states in the United States you visited.
Maybe 17, 18, maybe 20. 17,
18? Okay. What's the area of the country that you probably have the least amount of experience with traveling to?
Let's see, from like Wyoming, Montana, Oregon, Washington State, that area, when you go up towards Canada, I got nothing there.
It's kind of the opposite for me. I've been up in those areas, but I've never been to the northeastern corridor, further north. And, well, I have, but the places I'd really like to go, like Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire and upstate New York, particularly in the fall. I think that's a lot of people out there, at least that's a dream trip for them.
If you've never been, you need to go.
Now, I would love to. I really would. And that's something that my wife and I are passionate about. I mean, it is, I talked about, following passions and that sort of thing. We love travel. I think about all of the money I wasted on my kids when they were growing up, going to amusement parks of all things. And our life and their lives became so much more rich when we finally took them to Great Britain and started going there and taking side trips and those sorts of things. And it was, I think, and lament the fact. But, today's topic on Body Bags is actually Samuel Little. And Samuel Little's been gone now for a couple of years, I guess. And he allegedly the most prolific serial killer to date, as many as 93 homicides. A lot of this rests in the fact that he admitted to so many deaths and had an interesting way of recalling them. Have you heard very much about Samuel Little, Dave?
I've actually done a couple of shows on him and his paintings and things, but you mentioned the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. When you look at some of these prolific serial killers, I tend to lean towards the Henry Lee Lucas that probably lied about 2/3 of what he did. Whereas in the case of Samuel Little, he actually did not admit until much later in life, just prior to his death, actually, what he had done in terms of numbers. That's why I kind of look at, Henry Lee Lucas, the chief liar, and Samuel Little, who only admitted it when he knew I'm in jail the rest of my life anyway.
And actually, an interesting little side note, when I was still working in New Orleans, Henry Lucas's partner, Otis Toole, if you're familiar with that, he actually showed up in New Orleans, but he showed up in handcuffs. Remember, those guys they had a lot of bravado about them. And they were one of these dual teams of serial perpetrators. And he would go about trying to get free trips, essentially saying, yeah, I think I killed somebody here at that particular time. And I'm not going to go into all of the gory details, but one of my dear friends that was the commander of the homicide section at that time actually had to escort him around. Otis Toole. And it's a weird name, Otis. It's spelled like Otis, but he preferred for everybody to call him Otis. And so he was certainly a character. Sam Little, you wouldn't know what he was. You wouldn't know that he was there. I think he just kind of melded into the background, and he pursued and hunted, and he really was truly a hunter, Dave. These people that are very, very defenseless. As a matter of fact, take a wild guess as to a commonality that many of the victims had as far as an occupation goes.
Female, homeless, drug addict, and prostitution as a career.
Yeah, because it's something it's almost rote in our field. But those are the individuals that kind of slip through the cracks and nobody really takes notice of if they go missing, because they live in a very high-risk environment most of the time. They're interacting with total, and I mean total strangers in very dark, seedy areas, and you never know what someone's intent is. The victims, meantime, their intent is just to live hour to hour, just to exist and survive and to get a food or maybe have a roof over their head for a short period of time, have a few bucks in their pocket. But when you get an individual that is a predator that's out there that has literally, and by the admission of several investigators that work Samuel Little's cases, he's one of these people that perfected his craft. Perfected. When you begin to think about this, it's a really horrible thing to consider that he had gotten it down to a fine science. And I think, to be honest with you, Dave, I think that what caught up to Sam Little in the end was actually his age. I think he just kind of aged out. He's one of these people that actually survived to a ripe old age, even though he was incarcerated.
The one thing about Samuel Little is that in looking at the man's background, I try to figure out what made this guy turn out the way he did. And he was born in 1940. He had his first big arrest. The first time he was caught was a break-in and entering charge when he was 16. And if I'm not mistaken, even then, when he's a minor, and they were writing down where his mother was, and they didn't know, whereabouts unknown, at 16. And think about that, okay? Samuel Little, breaking and entering at the age of 16 in 1956, and they don't even know where his mother is. So this guy had the ability to move in many different directions. He didn't have anything holding him back. There was no home base to check in. There was no parental figure there for direction or for hope for the future if you change your ways, kind of thing that many of us take for granted. His thieving career began early and stayed that way, and that's why he is called one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But again, I don't know how many are real and how many aren't. I don't think he knew when you get right down to it.
I don't think he did either. And to back up just a little bit, he had alleged that when they kind of did a deep dive on him while he was incarcerated out in California, which is, by the way, that's where he actually died. He said he started having these fantasies, choking out females, even as a young child. He had a distinct memory of that going back all those years.
Wasn't it a teacher that he had this memory of a teacher, of him touching her neck?
Yeah, I think it was like a kindergarten teacher. Yeah, kindergarten or first grade teacher or something like that. Yeah, that he had this idea about choking her out. And we could go into all the psychology that's behind this. But at a base level, I know kids get angry and that sort of thing. Lord knows I've seen mine angry. But to what extent do they begin to fantasize, even at a young age? And that's certainly interesting. Bring down this kind of horror, or at least they're thinking about it at that young age. And so if that becomes kind of like a compulsion in your life, you begin to think about it. That's your driver. That's the reason I started out, kind of talking about vocation as opposed to avocation, passions. Some of these individuals, this is their main focus. Their main focus, obviously, many of these individuals, is to get to the next victim. It's like swinging from vine to vine. And that's what they're looking to do. Everything else in their life is kind of it's a peripheral issue. They're thinking about, do I need to get a job? We think about, I got to keep the lights on. I got to pay the bills, that sort of thing. Well, maybe so, But for them, that was just an aside. If I can go steal from somebody, if I can, do an armed robbery, if I can shake somebody down in some way, maybe sell a little dope, because at the end of the day, all I want to do is sexually assault women and choke them to death. From a period ranging from roughly 1970, we think, until 2005, Samuel Little traveled to 19 individual states and perpetrated as many as 93 homicides over that period of time. How in the world do you not get caught during that huge gap of time? I mean, we're talking about a massive bit of history here. Chronologically, you think about that, and it's something. It's hard to understand this. It's hard to make sense of it. And I think that probably, at least in my experience, one of the most difficult things is how the families make sense of it, particularly when you've got an individual victim who has been probably forgotten by the family to a certain degree, and then they just don't see them anymore. Maybe there were sporadic phone calls. Maybe there were letters. Maybe there were cards. Maybe there was contact at the holidays, but all of a sudden, we don't know what happened to her. She has vanished.
Interesting to point out, Joe, that in the time period we're looking at, okay, pre-2005, this is pre-smartphone. This is the last few years of Samuel Little's killing spree, if you want to call it that. But during, that was when cell phones and things like that started coming into play. But when you look at, according to him, his first murder taking place in 1970, going from there to 2005, a majority of that time, there was a real transition in how law enforcement solved crimes. I mean, you didn't have DNA like we expect it now. Solving a crime now, TV shows have burned us with this, but we think the average person that you go to a crime scene, you find a drop of blood, and there we go, we got the killer's DNA. Here it is. It's not the way it was. How did they solve crimes back in the pre-DNA days, Joe? What did they do when, first of all, you mentioned you've got somebody who is on the outside of what we consider normal behavior society. You've got they didn't have cell phones, as I mentioned, no email, no internet, and where you would have a daughter that had gone wayward, didn't communicate with the family often, and there was no real way of tracking them down. So when they do pass and they're an unidentified individual, being a Jane Doe, for example, Macon's Jane Doe comes to mind, but the family doesn't even know where to begin looking. The police don't know who she is, and the people they can talk to find out are street people who don't have the best recollections. You don't have DNA. You've got fingerprints if the person's been busted, and you can match those up. But how did you solve a crime in the 70s when you've got a dead a person on your hands that nobody's looking for?
You're a mind reader. I can't believe you're asking me this question, because it's the actions that were taken in Macon, Georgia back in 1977 that brought us to this point. And kind of a background, you're right, we didn't have the fine point, and I love I love to put it that way. I'm kind of a simple guy, and so if you imagine a number 1 pencil when you're in the first grade and that big blunted end on it, and imagine a modern mechanical pencil that has this micro tip on it, that's where we are. That's where we've come from. And the blunted point to biological evidence back then was essentially blood typing. When we're talking about pure biology, pure biological tiebacks, and that was reliant upon a couple of factors. First off, did you have sample? Were you able to separate, say, for instance, in the case of a rape victim, the rape victim's blood or the murder victim / sexual assault victim's blood from the killer's blood? And then if you've got the killer's blood, what's the sourcing of the blood? Did he cut himself in the midst of it? Was he shot? Was he punched and he was bleeding from his lip? Or was he what you refer to as a secretor? And back then that was a big deal, and it's still kind of a big deal. But, when you think about secretors in their saliva and then in seminal sample, and to a certain degree in fecal sample as well, secretors, they make up, I know I'm going to get this wrong, it seems like 35 to 40% of the population will secrete red blood cells into one of these samples, all right? So if you have ejaculate at the scene and you have a secretor, there's a chance that you will actually find a red blood cell in there. And if that's the case, then you can type it. But think about the types. We've got AB, then we've got A, B, and O. And so those are your only choices. I mean, you have O pos, O neg, B pos, B neg, A pos, A neg, and then you got AB pos, AB neg. But beyond that's as far down as you could really narrow it. And then you couple that with, well, if there's fingerprints left behind, or you can look for what's referred to as hair morphology. So if somebody, for instance, shed hair at a scene, you can type the hair back racially. You can say, well, this is an African American, this is Native American, this is Caucasian, this is Asian, that sort of thing. But that's about as fine a point that you can put on it. But still, back then we were doing rape kits, and it was important to do those. And I'm amazed now what they can kind of conjure up.
Joe, I hate to interrupt, but what is in a rape kit? I hear that term used all the time, but I have no idea.
Well, this is going to be kind of graphic, but our listeners are used to it. I'll go ahead and tell you what's in it. With a rape kit, it comes with swabs, essentially. Okay, so you're going to swab. And when I say swab, I'm not talking about like if you've taken a DNA sample test where they do a cheek scraping on you, where you kind of scrape it for 30 seconds, then you submit it. It's not like that. With swabs, if anybody has ever been to the doctor's office and you've seen these really long wooden handled Q-tip swabs, okay, you take a grouping of the swabs and you kind of cluster them together, and those will be inserted literally into each orifice of the body, besides the nose and the ears. They are left to sit there, okay? And you have to give those items a moment to absorb everything that is in that environment. Once those have had sufficient amount of time to absorb, you withdraw them, and then you take a glass slide, like when you think about microscopy, where you're looking through a microscope, and you do a smear on a slide with them, and you seal those up. You also seal the swabs up as well, and those are sent off. Sometimes they're left to dry for a few moments, and or for a day sometimes, and they're allowed to, kind of set in. But you're going to do an initial smear on those, and all of that's going to be submitted. Now, also contained within the rape kit, you'll find nail clippers where you can actually clip the nails, and those go into kind of an type of onion paper. It looks like onion paper. It's kind of thin, and you collect the nails, but not before you scrape them. And those are done with actually what looks like a cuticle tool that you push, or a wooden cuticle tool where you scrape underneath, and what you're looking for there are skin cells. And you're also going to do hair pluckings. So you'll do head pluckings and you'll do pubic pluckings to get hair for comparison. And many times you'll do combings as well. So if you have in the pubic area, you can actually take a comb and run it through that area, okay? And whatever you collect on that comb, that sample is set aside, and that can be analyzed. And there you're looking at the morphology of the follicle itself, of the hair follicle, to try to get an idea, first off, if it's human versus animal, if there's something caught up in there, in that cluster of hairs. And then perhaps you can tell if there's another human other than the one that you have. All right. See what I'm saying? And so you've got that collection, that static collection. So all of that goes into capturing, just for that moment in time when you have that body, and that body is the biggest piece of evidence that you have in the morgue. You capture as much evidence, as much information per that evidence off of this individual, and perhaps, just perhaps, the perpetrator as well. Traditionally, when you were doing a rape kit, first off, there was a chance that you were looking for ejaculate within the body of the victim. And that would, you would capture that ejaculate on the swab. And also, if there was contained within that ejaculate red blood cells from the perpetrator, that's one thing. And many people would say, well, if you have a female victim and you have ejaculate within the body, that confirms that we have, in fact, had some type of sexual contact. You can't necessarily say that it was a sexual assault, because if you're talking about a grouping of people, for instance, and this adds another layer to this, it's very complicated, which goes to Samuel Little. He's preying upon whom? Well, he's preying upon individuals that are in the sex trade. So you might have individuals that have had multiple partners in the same night. Just kind of wrap your brain around that just for a second. And so how do you separate his ejaculate from someone else's ejaculate that might be present within the victim's body? And the other thing you're going to look to with this is also, is there signs of forcible rape, where you have trauma to either the vaginal area or the rectal area, where this event is being forced onto the subject. So you'll look for things like abrasions and tears and all that. I know specifically of one series of homicides that were perpetrated by a serial killer, where the individual would have masturbatory fantasies over the deceased, which happens in the postmortem phase. So after they've killed them, they would masturbate on the body. And, well, that's not something that you're going to capture that sample from a rape kit. Those are external swabbings, which you would use with a swab. You'd have to use saline, apply that area over the body where you think you see evidence of ejaculate on the body. And you can use alternative lighting sources in order to, kind of pick that up and see if it fluoresces. And then you go in and you catch that sample that way. So it is a multi-layered, these cases, that's why they're so very complicated. And it amazes me, and it seems like the news media never learns, because they'll say, well, why don't we have results yet? Why don't we have results yet? Just the process itself takes hours upon hours to conclude. It's not just about opening up a body and trying to determine the cause of death. Again, it goes back to my supposition that the body is the biggest piece of evidence that you possess.
That is a lot more involved than I thought of. When I've heard the term rape kit used, I'm so glad you did break that down. It helps me to now understand what detectives are doing back in the day and now. That is the one thing that is consistent with a rape kit done in 1977 and a rape kit done today.
There are moments in time that many of us have had that work in investigations where I think retrospectively we go back and we view ourselves as historians. When I think back to the year 1977, there's certain music that I remember. I remember just starting junior high school. I remember playing sports. I remember the smell of my mom's cooking. But in 1977, in the town of Macon, Georgia, along a road called Arkwright, there was a discovery that was made. The choices and the decisions that those investigators made all those years ago came to fruition all these years later, where a lady was finally identified through DNA. What say you, Dave?
It wasn't as simple as DNA. That's what I say. I looked at this Joseph Scott Morgan, and I have to tell you that over the last few years, I am so thankful that we met, because you're a great guy and I like talking to you, but I've learned so much about what law enforcement investigators deal with from the moment they're called to a crime scene to the moment of conviction of the suspect. And so much is made of forensic stuff. We have television shows. Fortunes have been made on dramatizing DNA and forensic stuff that we take for granted. It's so much more involved than what any of us know. But when you've got somebody that is found dead in 1977, think about it. Jimmy Carter's the president. One of the things that we were following it then was Billy Carter urinating outside of LAX. We've got, an energy crisis. We've got a lot going on back then. And yet, going from Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, all these years, all these presidents, all these things go by, and there is an unidentified person. And the citizens of Macon, Georgia, should be thankful to have a group of men and women that are so determined to solve this that they were able to analyze what their officers did in 1977 and use that combined with the latest technology of today to actually determine beyond a shadow of a doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, who the actual perpetrator of the crime is and who this person was.
Isn't that something? You think about that all those years ago, that decision that law enforcement, the medical examiner at that time, or the county coroner, such as the case down in Bibb County, Georgia, which is where Macon is, that decision that they made to have this unidentified, they refer to her as Jane Doe. I think she wound up becoming, what, correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, wasn't she referred to as Macon's?
The newspaper there is called The Telegraph, and The Telegraph dubbed her Macon Jane Doe.
In 1977, it was, people kind of throw this around a lot, but it was a more innocent time. Didn't really seem like it, but it truly was compared to nowadays. And you didn't have as many of these really violent events like this that would happen. And something so shocking in this kind of sleepy southern town where she's found along this road, almost discarded as though she were trash. And they knew nothing of who she was, but they thought enough at that moment in time when they did the postmortem exam on her to do one of these rape kits. The fact that this thing survived, that they were able to retain enough of a biological element within this kit, I think, where it winds up tying back to Samuel Little, who in his own way had actually stated that he had killed women throughout the South, not just the South, but all over. But he had made his way through Georgia. Do you know he actually was originally from Georgia? He was born in Georgia. He grew up, I think, up north in Ohio, if I'm not mistaken, but he was born in Reynolds, Georgia. And so this is an area that he probably still had family in the Georgia area. He migrated around a lot. And as a result of retaining this biological sample that they had, they were able to finally get Jane Doe of Macon Jane Doe. They were finally able to get her identified through genetic genealogy.
They were actually able to identify that Samuel Little had raped and murdered her. They were able to prove that genetically, but they didn't know her name. They didn't know who she was, but they knew that he killed her. Think about that for just a minute. They were able to solve the crime, but couldn't solve who she was.
Yeah, isn't that something? This huge genetic stew is what it comes down to. If you can imagine that in your mind, that might be a little off-putting, when you think about it. But we truly are. We're this huge mishmash because we're all mutts, comes down to it. But we have this kind of genetic stew that's brewing out there. It's hard when you're taking that real high altitude view of the situation. You're thinking, how in the world are we able to get an identity on an individual from all those years ago because of the sample that they took at that particular point in time, where they were able to retain a biological sample of the victim? They were able to plug that into a national database. And through her multiple lines, they were able to determine who, in fact, she was.
Well, what is the forensic genealogy? I know I'm leaving out some terms here because I don't know what I'm talking about other than, forensic. I know what that is, and I know genealogy, but genetic genealogy, what is it and how does it come into play today in solving what had been previously called unsolved crimes?
Yeah, not just unsolved, but in our previous context, I think unsolvable. I still remember, standing over, remains that you just sit there and you scratch your head and you're looking for something early on in my career, and we had nothing to hang our hat on. We just knew that we would never be able to determine. And that there was those whispers off in the distance, DNA, but there was nothing that had utility to it back then because it was so very cumbersome. It was a cumbersome process. But with most DNA genealogical pursuits, they have a sample that is set aside as a result of something that they've collected off of a body. One of the big tricks is it still viable? And what happens is that it's so fragile that the sample can become degraded over a period of time if it's not been taken well care of. And in this particular instance, it was. So when you have genetic genealogy going on, a sample can actually be submitted into a data bank that might be associated with a group like NamUs, which is a forensic group that's based, it's based upon this idea that everybody deserves to be identified, and there would be a static collection of the samples that are out there, and you combine that with people that have been submitting samples of their own to try to determine their own genealogy, perhaps, which is fascinating in and of itself that we can do that nowadays. But every now and then you'll get a hit. Most of the time, what the key to solving these cases are, relative to relatives, if you will, are cousins. We have thousands and thousands of cousins out there. Now, they're going to be at different degrees, obviously, but the trick is that you begin to, and what these genealogists do is that they combine their ability to construct genealogical trees along with the science that's involved of narrowing that path down because of all of these markers along our strands of DNA that make us individual. They give us our individual characteristics, where you have things like phenotyping that come in that determine, our hair color and our eye color and our stature and all those sorts of things that are unique to our familial line. And suddenly, can you imagine sitting there? And I've always been fascinated by this, not being a DNA guy myself and certainly not being a genealogist, an amateur one, but not one at all. And suddenly, can you imagine, Dave, you're sitting there at your computer, you're working a case, and boom, it just blasts. You've created this thing that just comes to reality. Suddenly you say, oh my God, I've got 8 cousins here of this person. Who is this person? Now, what do you do with that information if you're a police officer? Well, you apply good old-fashioned shoe leather at that point in time. You go out and you knock on doors and you say, hey, do you have somebody in your family that you may be related to that's missing, that you guys have not had any knowledge of in some time? After you go through that number of people, all of those cousins, sooner or later, it'll begin to narrow down your field.
Well, they're not starting from zero anyway. They've done in some investigation, law enforcement has, but they've built a case on the evidence that they have. And so when those cousins do pop up, it starts filling in the blanks. We saw it happen with the Sherry Papini case a couple of years ago. She faked her own abduction, and when everything was said and done, the sweatshirt that she was wearing the day she popped back up, they took it and they found some DNA on it, I don't know, spit or whatever. And when they broke it down, it was actually came back to the father of the man that she was staying with her during all that time. And it was just funny because once they narrowed it down to that family name and this guy, they had their connection to Papini and went, okay, here it is. And I look at these from the news standpoint of how we cover them, Joe. And whenever you see that the genetic genealogy and you realize people have uploaded their own DNA to websites, 23andMe or whatever, and they're trying to find their own family tree. I think my brother-in-law did this, that it opens up this whole new world of potential suspects that, and there's been some legal fighting about that and what is acceptable and, what is free and not. But the bottom line is if you can take this genetic genealogy and follow it back and can identify somebody who for nearly 50 years has been nothing except Macon's Jane Doe, I just can't think of how much better this is going to get.
Many, many mysteries will potentially be unlocked as a result of this technology moving forward. And I think in the case of this poor woman who all those years ago came face to face with a monster who wrapped his hands around her throat and choked the life out of her, you're going to have many of these mysteries that will be solved. And that's certainly the case with Yvonne Pless, who had remained unidentified for all these years, and finally her family has some answers.
Samuel Little actually died on December 30th of 2020 in Los Angeles County area hospital in Southern California. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation sources don't indicate a cause of death. And I bring that up only to make sure you understand that he was in prison in his final days. Samuel Little was, and had been there for some time. He was 80 years old when he died. And at the time of his death, Yvonne Pless had not been identified. That has only taken place in the recent past. And when they did actually identify who had previously been known as Macon Jane Doe, and when the family of Yvonne Pless was notified and she was no longer a Jane Doe but was identified, again, Samuel Little already dead. But her family had the opportunity to get closure. And they actually issued a statement that said, "We appreciate the interest in our family member's story. When Captain Jones and Miss Hutzel notified us that Yvonne had been identified, we were unaware she was deceased. We are mourning the loss of our loved one and have no comments at this time. We ask that our privacy be respected." That is the story of Macon Jane Doe, her identity, Yvonne Pless.
I'm Joseph Scott Morgan, and this is Body Bags.